that is a timer, so when it dings, you'll know what I mean. Because I can ramble, not quite as good as my my former boss, Mark Morgan, but I can tend to ramble. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. Border security is national security. In every town, city, and state across this entire nation is a border town, city, and state. And I want to ask you one more question. What did you just hear me say? I bet that most of you, because you volunteered your time, just heard me make a common sense fact, a couple of them. Right? Nothing stays at the border, it's a transit area. Obviously, border security is national security. Those are facts. A little bit of my background, though. 29 years, almost 30 years, I spent U.S. Border Patrol. At the end of my career, I was the chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. I became chief under Trump, but I'm probably the only person in this room that worked in the Biden administration for about 8 months. And I'll touch on that a little bit. But the vast majority of my career, not necessarily by choice, but by assignments, was in Southern California and Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed, but neither one of those areas are bastions for conservative, pro-border security groups of people. So all the facts and evidence that you've heard today that I'm not going to go through and repeat over and over again, it's all true. But I found when I was talking to people, especially in California, and again, even during the Trump administration when I was trying to talk to Congress, I realized that facts and evidence were irrelevant if what the person heard out of my mouth initially, to them, they heard a political talking point. They shut down. So I want to kind of follow on a little bit some of the things you've heard today. My focus today is talking to you a little bit more about how you can make a difference. I'm not going to regurgitate everything. I will talk a little bit about the difference between the different administrations, but I'll just tell you this. My entire career from day one until January 21st, 2020, right? To get the date screwed up here a little bit, 2021. The border was getting better and better. It was getting more secure. And now we went backwards farther than we ever could before. The border was more secure under the Trump administration, but every administration had tried to do something, just at different levels. The Biden administration has gone completely backwards in the opposite direction. But again, that sounds like a political talking point. Here's what I want to try to talk you guys into doing a little bit. Attack this a little bit differently. So I have a couple more questions for you real quick to phrase it, to kind of put this into context. I want you to think about your house, your own personal house. It could be an apartment, it could be anything else. Do you, when someone comes to your home, do you expect them to come to a certain place and maybe announce their presence in a certain way? Do you expect, when you go to someone else's house, what do you do? Where do you go? Just think about that for a minute. If you can't control who and what enters your personal home, you have absolutely no personal security. And it's really the exact same thing at a national level. If we can't control who and what enters our home, we don't have any national security whatsoever. So then you, by the way, I guarantee you do this all the time. Every time someone comes to your home, you do a threat assessment. You don't probably use that term, and you may have not thought about it before, but I guarantee every single one of you since you were a kid just instinctively did it. You look at the individual, do they look like someone you know? Have they been in your home before? Are they a family member? Do they fit the culture, the surroundings? Are they acting normal or are they manic? All those things go through your mind very quickly before you decide if you're even going to open it with a chain, open it all the way. It's the same thing at a national level, to overly simplify this. We expect people in our homes to come to our front door. If they sneak into our home any other way or try to get into our home forcibly, it's pretty much codified in every state across this country that can be perceived as a threat and you can react appropriately. At our national level, we have ports of entry, 328 of them, that are established as our front doors, and we just ask everybody to go through that front door, period. It doesn't matter if you're a U.S. citizen or if you're a foreign national, you're supposed to come through that front door. You as taxpayers pay Customs and Border Protection officers to do a congressionally mandated threat assessment at that port of entry, just like you do at your home. And they don't get to make it up, though. They apply the rules, the laws that Congress has enacted, who and what can and cannot come into the country. We can change that at any point in time, by the way, by law. And then that's what they pick. So that's within Customs and Border Protection. That's the guys we fondly call blue shirts. The United States Border Patrol's job, I'm overly simplifying this, I know, but the United States Border Patrol's job is to simply patrol in between those ports of entry, in between the front doors,
and just make sure nobody comes into our home outside the front door. Does that make sense? Does that sound racist or xenophobic when you do it at your own home? Does it sound like it should be when you do it at a national level? My experience in California over the years was I could interact with some of the people that prior to a face-to-face conversation, every indicator I would have had is they were about as far left-leaning open borders as you could possibly think. But all it really took was some home analogies like that, some different conversations not about immigration, but about simply border security, simply knowing who and what's coming into our home. Isn't that common sense? Isn't that practical? And then how do you apply that on a national level? That got a crack in the armor over and over and over again. When I could get one of those people to have a little crack in the armor and then actually take them to the physical border, walk them around, we made a lot of headway. There's a lot of people currently on the left side of the aisle at a national level that quietly will still advocate and support for border security. A little too quietly right now, if you ask me. But I've interacted with some of them and they've shown rational thought. The opposite was also true, though. I brought people to the border. I spent hours with them touring, showing them what San Diego used to be like. And when I started in the Border Patrol, there was really no, it was 1992, there was really no border wall in San Diego. The original border wall, by the way, was recycled landing mat from Vietnam that Border Patrol turned into a border wall. We changed the entire dynamic in San Diego. We reestablished law and order there using that and policies, as you talked about before. But if all the person heard from the beginning of my presentation was talking points, everything I showed them all day almost became irrelevant. But if I could get that crack in the armor and get them to realize, hey, wait a minute, it is just like a home. And you save the immigration piece until afterwards, because we should and can and always should have debates about who and what we let into our home. Because by the way, we don't talk about it, but we're having the same debate nationally about narcotics now, about marijuana. Is it legal? Is it not? What are we going to allow? What are we not? It's the same dynamic. Here's the argument, though. You can't get to that point. You can't get to a policy discussion on who or what we should let into the country unless you can control it. So unless we can actually force people, encourage people to come through our front door, everything else that we kind of discussed here today and how you manage it is just triage, and you're never going to get ahead. So really, if you don't remember anything else today from me, I hope you remember a home analogy, if you will. And it's simply, is it wrong to ask people to come to your front door of your home? Then why would it be wrong to ask people to come to the front door of our nation? And then we can talk about who and what comes into the country. I want to talk a little bit more about Border Patrol specifically and their role, their mission set, and why this mass illegal immigration today is such a critical threat. And I think you've heard some of it today. And to steal something from my old boss, I just want to foot stomp a couple of those. Again, if you can't control who comes in, it's total loss. And right now, we can't control it. So when you hear the term operational control of the border, that means that we literally know who and what's coming into our home with a high level of confidence. The legal definition is we control 100%. But from a law enforcement perspective, it's more of a risk-based, and we believe we have a high level of confidence, and then you can deploy personnel based on what you think is the higher risk. If I've got an organization that's involved in sex trafficking, I've got an organization that's involved in smuggling economic migrants, and I've only got one agent, I can make those deployments. That's the concept. We were getting better and better and better at that going forward. As we did that, under multiple prior administrations, but leaps and bounds under the Trump administration, that border wall infrastructure, which was not just a barrier, by the way, it was also technology that was built in with that, literally bought agents time. Every foot of border wall that went in place allowed a single agent to cover a much broader area by himself. Let me give you a perfect example. One section of border, very out of control, 12-mile section. We were able to put in a double barrier with some technology, and we were able to drive crossings through that area down by over 95%, but we were also able to pull 150 agents out of that area that used to have to be there to patrol it. Without the infrastructure, 150 agents. With the infrastructure, 150 less. That's $28 million return on the investment every single year. That's just money. You know what else it did, though? Guess where those agents went? They didn't go home. They started interviewing people we arrested. Every sex trafficking case ever found by United States Border Patrol was based on a good interview. A face-to-face interview, human face-to-face, where they saw the kid acted weird, the woman, the guy sometimes acted weird. Fake families, same thing. Guess what's not taking place today at all? Those interviews. So we were building, under the last administration, we were building out systems where Border Patrol agents actually documented everything that was going on out in the field. All of those interviews, we had rules in place to the maximum extent possible. Every single group of aliens that were arrested, at least some of them got what we called an ACE debrief, but an in-depth debrief. We were mapping out the cartels down to the coyotes, who operated, what did they smuggle, how did they come across. We were leveraging that information to work with the investigative agencies and then forcing Mexico, through leverage of the Department of State and others, to actually take action on these criminal organizations and starting to dismantle them. The crisis on the border today, the mass migration that's going on today, over 2 million illegal aliens encountered, 800,000 more documented gotaways. The Border Patrol doesn't have time. Under the Trump administration, at the end of every month, because we talked about transparency a minute ago, I was mandated to stand up in front of reporters, give out last month's statistics, and then answer any questions. And they weren't pre-scripted, we just answered the questions. Under the Biden administration, and then I was constantly asked, hey, what else can we do? Are there other policies or procedures? Congress isn't doing their job, what else can we do? The day that it switched, and I was working for the Biden administration, a gag order was put on me and my entire organization immediately. We were not allowed to talk publicly anymore unless we read scripted talking points. The scripted talking points I was given were not accurate. I was told to say that the border was secure because the secretary had just said it on a weekend talk show. And I was like, well, but the border's not secure and there's evidence to include that. And they're like, well, we thought you would like it. I'm like, I would love it if it was true, but it's not true. I'm not going to say that. And then the other thing that they gave me was, hey, how can you process faster? Everything they did was about processing people faster, not slowing down the flow. What does that do? That means those agents can't go do those debriefs. We have no idea now who's being sex trafficked. We have hundreds and hundreds of miles of border that are wide open. They're not being patrolled because at the beginning of a shift, 60 to 80% of the agents are assigned indoors doing processing every day. Within probably maybe 2 hours, because the cartel owns every piece of border. And if anybody ever questions that also, by the way, ask them if someone's going to claim asylum, they were going to find the very first law enforcement officer they could. Why would they wait until 2:30 in the morning to cross the Rio Grande River with their children? Or why would you go way out into the desert by Lordsburg, New Mexico, or between Deming and Lordsburg to cross the border? It's because the cartel controls everything and they want to overwhelm Border Patrol resources so that they can bring in what? So that they can bring in people that are being trafficked. So they can bring in criminals that are willing to pay significantly more money because they can't interact with Border Patrol. Everybody in this room also needs to understand, but you got to hold, when you're having conversations with other people, you got to wait for all this, by the way, until you have the agreement that it's not unreasonable to ask people to come through our front door. But right now, all these people are not coming through the front door, and this administration has made it so that it's the same. They're allowed to cut in line. There's no deterrent for crossing in between, or no distraction for crossing in between the ports of entry. If they go to a port of entry, they're kind of insane. But anyway, they're paying a large amount of money to go around. Why? We talked earlier about the 66 terrorists, the 66 individuals on the National Terrorist Watch List that have been apprehended. That's with 60 to 80% of the agents never going out into the field. So what else got by? The 800,000 documented gotaways that we talk about in the Border Patrol. And by the way, if you go back, I am very proud of this. Mark Morgan, if he was still in the room, I would thank him. The Border Patrol never talked about gotaways until towards the end of the Trump administration. We started reporting those numbers out publicly. I felt that it was very important to tell the whole picture. And I wasn't going to go tell people that we were 100% successful under the Trump administration. I just wanted to show how we were getting better. But every one of those has science behind it. There's a process and a procedure the Border Patrol goes through. They have to verify before those numbers go into a database. And agents are actually the ones relied upon that to try to minimize any kind of political influence. But that's today. Those numbers are with 60 to 80% of the Border Patrol agents never going to the field. That is today with the Biden administration shutting down all activity on the border wall, which included the technology laydown. So Texas specifically has no technology for the most part along the southwest border. Where Arizona has some pretty nice, we call them fixed towers. They have radar, they have cameras. Texas doesn't have any of that. Texas relies on the overly expensive, Border Patrol in Texas relies on this overly expensive process, or things called an aerostat. Hey, guess what it's susceptible to? Weather. Guess what you guys have a little bit more of? Weather. That thing is down constantly. So that 800,000 documented gotaways, that is the minimum. That's the minimum. Here's what we do know about those 800,000 gotaways. They weren't looking for a Border Patrol agent. They weren't walking up and surrendering. Why? I want to bring this full circle. I'm going to give some time back towards the end here. When you're our enemy today is multiple, right? The cartel is clearly an enemy. But I don't think we're ever going to get a chance to fight that enemy unless we attack the enemy internally, which is two things. It's ignorance, and then there's this hidden agenda. I choose to believe that most of the citizens that I interact with, and even some of the political officials that I've interacted with over the years, are ignorant. And if you can get them to accept the fact that it's not unreasonable to ask people to come to our front door, you actually have hope of being able to convince them to look at a situation differently. But if you can't get past that point, if you jump right into the immigration debate and are they migrant workers or shouldn't we allow more people in, you're never going to, I can tell you 30 years of doing this, you're never going to make any headway whatsoever. But we need to fight that ignorance, and I need you guys to help me do that because, oh, by the way, I have no doubt, and I've spent almost 30 years being very careful to be nonpartisan because as a government employee, I was never a political appointee. Even as the chief, I was a government employee, not a political appointee. Very, very cautious in that arena. However, I do believe most of you, I know how you're going to vote. But that's not going to get us there, right? You are going to have to get uncomfortable and talk to people that think they know about the border that literally don't. You're going to have to find a way to communicate with these people, and you're not going to do it by shouting and yelling, or I appreciate the social media comments too, about getting into a social media war. You've got to find a baseline, and I would just suggest to you that the home analogy, the front door thing, has worked for me for about 30 years. And let me put some dollars and cents to this. When Trump was elected, we started building the border wall. I was not the chief of the Border Patrol yet. I was a chief out in San Diego sector. The very first border wall project was a 14-mile project to actually replace the landing mat fence that was falling down on the border in San Diego. We put that out for bid. It was estimated to be about anywhere from 100 to maybe 170, 180 million dollar contract. No one bid on it. We put it out for bid again. We didn't have a single contractor in the nation bid on it again. I found out the reason, after talking to some of these companies that always bid on our projects, we found out that a state legislator in California had presented a bill that if any contractor worked on any border wall infrastructure in the state of California, they would be banned from all California contracts, any state contract going forward. That never passed, but it didn't matter. The contractors were so afraid of it, they didn't take action. This very, very far left-wing legislator. Against recommendations, I went and met with him. We had a fairly decent conversation, and I finally got him, and he knew everything, by the way, about the border. He grew up going into Tijuana his whole life, but throughout that conversation, I picked up on the fact that he never got dust on his shoes. He had crossed through a port of entry, he'd driven and he walked back and forth, but he'd never been on the border outside of a port of entry. So I chose to not argue with him about anything, and I just highlighted that and said, hey, why don't you come down and I'll show you a different perspective and then we can pick up the conversation again. In the interest of time, I'll save you the conversation, but I used the home analogy again, and I explained to him that his whole life he's been coming and going through the front door, and that's not what I'm talking about. He came down to the border in less than 2 hours in San Diego. He went back and pulled that bill. The very first, thank you. Put dollars and cents behind this, though, and this is why it really does matter. These are your tax dollars that Texas has spent twice now, right? Once on Lone Star and once on the federal. The first border wall project, when we finally got somebody to bid on it, only one contractor bid. This was before the bill got pulled, and it came in at about $170 million, and it was for an 18-foot high bollard wall for 14 miles of it. No land purchase or anything. We owned everything already. We didn't have to do the EAs because it was already disturbed, as many as it was already disturbed land. The second wall contract that went out was another 14 miles. It was a secondary fence in San Diego. Some of the land we owned, we had to buy 2 more miles of land to basically finish this off. And it was 30-foot high, and it included technology. And it came in $70 million cheaper than the initial one because it was competitively bid out. So there's definitely long-term, but my point to all that was everybody on my staff told me it was a waste of time to go talk to this guy. And I really, truly still believe if I would have went in there charging like I normally want to do, and fist going and arguing about how stupid his position is and everything that we all want to do on social media and that our guts tell us to do, we would have never made any progress. I didn't change that guy's political position. He didn't become a hardcore big border security advocate overnight. But guess what else he didn't do? The rest of the time I was in San Diego, and to my knowledge now, he's never pushed another bill forward that actually got in the way of border security. So that in and of itself is a win. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Please talk to your legislators. Actually, I do want to talk about one more thing. Talk to your legislators. Talk to your friends. But don't just go in there like a bull in a china cabinet. Think it through, and you may have your own analogy or another way to do it, but we have to be able to have an adult conversation. Here's the last thing. I meant to do this a minute ago. I apologize. It's a little bit out of order. Transparency is important. So this is for the state legislators. Right now, where we're having this debate of what can a state do, what can the federal government do, right? A lot of states want to know from the Biden administration where all these illegal aliens are being flown all over the country. And the Biden administration, one of the very few honest statements they make, because they do lie like crazy, is that they don't know. And they don't. Because they launder your tax dollars through DHS grants and intentionally give it to these NGOs without any requirements. I managed grants for Border Patrol for years because we have a Stone Garden grant where we give state sheriffs and local police a lot of money to help us along the border. We require reports. We require justification for that money, but these other grants, they don't. All we need to do, I'm pushing hard for some legislation at the federal level, but you can also do this at the state level. If there's any regulatory authority over an organization, or if you're giving them any money, that's an in. And you can start mandating certain reporting, certain data be documented and recorded. Because right now, we talk about how many illegal aliens are in this country, and are they pro, or are they negative draw on society. It all becomes subjective because there's no real data. And Texas could take a big step forward. We'll talk about invasion declaration here in a minute, but it could take a big step forward in just mandating that if there's a regulatory authority over an organization, or if you're giving them any money, force them to document, is that support going to a U.S. citizen? Is it going to a foreign national? And if it's going to a foreign national, you can have a whole list. Is it a lapper, basically a resident alien? Is it somebody that's on an NTA, which basically means they're an illegal alien waiting for court? But that would give us the data that we need to have more adult conversations. That, and I'm going to get a little partisan, that scares the Democrats more than anything else. Because right now they're able to push this fake narrative, this is all about economic migrants, and they don't want to talk about all the other threats because the data is just not out there. They can say they don't know where these people are going because the data is not out there. But you guys here locally, and you can push your state legislators and you can push your federal legislators. This should be an easy win, because why shouldn't you push for transparency so the American public knows where their money's going? I think that's another easy win. Thank you guys for your time. I didn't really want to get way in the weeds because on a lot of the threats, but I will say everything you heard today, you didn't see me in the back raise my hand calling foul. These threats are real. Our country's future is at stake. You have two choices now. You saw them. You have the last administration or this administration. The last administration, from my perspective, was open and transparent about everything we did. I never got scripted talking points. This one told me to read off of a script, and it wasn't true. You're seeing the devastation that's going on now, And this is the last thing that if you can get that break in the armor when you're having this conversation, just ask somebody, really? Where do you want your grandkids growing up? Because that's the other thing. They don't think second, third level effects. The emotional, immediate, oh, I want to help this person, makes people feel good. But over I think Mark used the number, over 1,000 people have died crossing the border, probably more. I know of at least 600 that have been documented by the actual Border Patrol. I think that we win the humane argument, we win the law and order argument. Chaos anywhere in the world kills people. Law and order creates situations where people thrive, businesses thrive, and people want to be there. And by the way, I'll end with this. Kamala, if you're listening, I already know the root cause of illegal immigration. It's because America's great. Please don't screw it up.
I can't see who's back there at the very back. Rodney, will you grab Ken? Okay, sorry. Didn't see you. Okay, next we have Ken Cuccenelli. He is a senior fellow for Immigration and Homeland Security with the Center for Renewing America. He is the former Attorney General of Virginia. He served as the senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and also served as the Principal Director and senior official performing the duties of the Director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And I don't know how you got this on a name tag. I mean, this is wild. I'm just kidding. I also will be out with cards and pens. If you have questions, as Ken gets to the end of his, we will do a question and answer. But I will ask the questions for you. I'm not going to give anybody the microphone. I've learned from my eras. But anyway, I will have cards and pens. Just wave at me and I'll get them to you. So, Mr. Ken Cuccenelli, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all very much. Good to be with you. And you've been bombarded with all sorts of great news about what's going on here in America today. One of the things I'm going to focus on, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the problem. You all have been, I think, thoroughly introduced to it by some of the best experts in America. I mean, you just listened to one of them, Rodney Scott, Mark Morgan this morning, and so forth, and you've got plenty of local experience that has spoken to this as well. Let me play with this real quick, see if I make it work. Wrong button. Let's try that one. Ha ha ha. All right. I work with the Center for Renewing America, a relatively new think tank founded by Russ Vought, who was Trump's OMB director. That's the guy who runs the budget and therefore had his fingers on everything. And one of the beauties and why I'm so happy to be senior fellow for Homeland Security and Immigration there is Center for Renewing America, more than any other think tank in America, is taking on legitimate but hard positions that, frankly, other think tanks just tend to shy away from. And I'm going to talk to you about one of those. But the beauty is that as our friends and allies learn about these things, they do tend to move in the right direction. The needle can move. And I'm going to talk to you today about states defending themselves at the border using constitutional authority. What you see up in front of you is the guarantee clause. We all remember this from civics. Usually it's described to us as preserving the Republican form of government. That's form, not party. It also requires the federal government to protect state governments against insurrection against the state government. And the third protection the federal government is obligated to provide to all 50 states is to protect each and every one of them from invasion. Anybody in here think they're doing that job? No, and that is clearly a policy decision. That is intentional. That's the open borders policy of our president, and it's having all the consequences you've heard about today. The Constitution, you saw Article 4, Section 4, that's the guarantee clause. The Constitution, the founders provided us a way to protect ourselves. They didn't provide it so much as preserve it. It's easy to forget here 240 almost years since the Constitution was written and ratified, but the states formed the federal government. We are not subsidiaries. The states are sovereign. Those sovereigns together created the federal government, which is also sovereign. So we have this dual sovereignty arrangement. But all of the authority the federal government has was given by the states, and only that authority. Now, that's been whittled away over the years, but included in that is the fact that the states preserve to themselves certain authorities. And just like you and I as individuals have the right to defend ourselves, our sovereign states preserve to themselves the right to defend themselves. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution is about the legislature, Congress. Article 2 is about the executive branch, the presidency. Article 3 is about the judiciary. At the very end of Article 1, Section 10, the very last paragraph of Article 1, Section 10, which is Clause 3, and I've got it written up here, I hope you can read it. It lists a bunch of things that states cannot do without Congress's permission. That's why it's in Article 1, because you need Congress's permission to do it. One of them is enter into agreements with foreign powers. Another one is wage war. But that restriction, you will notice, has an exception. And the exception is unless actually invaded. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. I know I don't have to convince you, nor, by the way, do I have to convince ordinary Americans. It's not that a lot of people poll on this, but I saw a poll recently where a measurable majority of Americans believe we are being invaded. We don't have to convince our fellow Americans of that fact. And I know I don't have to convince you all here in Texas. So again, Article 1, Section 10 restricts certain things from the states, things they can't do. They can't impose tariffs, for instance. That was one of the things. They can't exercise war powers, or they can with Congress's consent, but heck, if Congress is going to consent to that, they'll just declare war. They'll just declare war, which they have the power to do. They have the power to do that. But a state can exercise those war powers if they're actually invaded, or if they know an invasion is coming. When this was written, now among the things that I do, I'm a constitutional lawyer. This hasn't been litigated before, though it has been implemented before by Texas. Before the Border Patrol, which is not, Rodney could tell me, is right about 100 years old, 27, so we're not there yet. Closing in. Texas defended its own border, and nobody batted an eye at it. There were no lawsuits because nobody questioned it, because there was no good reason to question it. That authority was preserved. And you can see here where Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers, talks about partial union, partial consolidation. Not everything was turned over to the federal government. The states preserved powers. They gave what they called powers requisite for the common defense. The federal government has everything they need to protect us from the current invasion. They are just choosing not to use it. They have the powers requisite to the challenge. And the war powers in this particular part of the Constitution really weren't controversial to the framers. I think the technical term is no-brainer. I think Patrick Henry used it in a very eloquent speech once. No-brainer. That the elements of this particular provision are, as Madison said, a Virginian, by the way, fall within reasonings which are either so obvious or have been so fully developed that they may be passed over without remark. That's how they said no-brainer back then. Now, by the way, one of the best written materials on this subject is the Attorney General of Arizona, Mark Brnovich's legal opinion he issued earlier this year. I want to say the end of January, beginning of February. And I mentioned that I was a constitutional lawyer. When you fight over constitutional definitions for the first time, it's only half law. It's half history. It really is. It's one of the reasons I love that line of work, frankly. It is so fascinating. It brings you right into our history and why the framers did the things they did. And you can continue to roll through there and continue to learn new elements of just how wise they were. And the history here is laid out in part in the Brnovich opinion, and he notes that Madison used an example of the utilization of this power we're talking about for Virginia, not the southwest border, which then was Georgia. I'll come back to that. But Virginia, and his example to use it against was smugglers. Well, well, well. Isn't that convenient? Gosh, it's like he knew what he was doing. How about that? Did I mention he's Virginian? I think I did. Yeah, okay. I didn't want to miss that. We had some good ones. But what you will read, I promise you, when you see this come up, I've been to Texas before, I've been to Arizona, and when press happens, the reporter calls, the local law school, gets a professor on the phone, says, "What do you think of this?" "It's stupid. Only nations can invade." Really? Really? What have you read on the subject? Do you think James Madison might have an idea of how this might apply? So I promise you, if you look at articles that cover our promotion of this legal idea, this policy idea, this solution, God forbid we solve something, that's what you're going to see. And many times it'll be from our friends. We've all heard the phrase, with authority comes responsibility, right? It's a very Christian concept. And if you want to avoid the responsibility, one way to do it is to deny the authority in the first place. I am not suggesting that what we're talking about here is settled law. It has never been fought over. Again, for decades of Texas experience, and Arizona, New Mexico, and California, it was implemented, but nobody disputed it. It wasn't in debate. And I'm going to come to that Texas specific a little later. You see some of the results of the border crisis. You all know this. You've heard about it in painful detail here today. The notion that they care more about people than we do is outrageous. At the state level, Texas has done more than any other state to date in its response. Billions of dollars, additional personnel, resources applied to the border, more wall being built, But as Mark Morgan would have said, or may have said earlier, I wasn't here, but I've heard him say it many times, the wall doesn't matter if the people behind the wall don't have the will and ability to enforce the law. Walls are to help them, not to do their job. We count on the men and women of law enforcement, of the Guard, of the Border Patrol to protect us in this regard, your local sheriffs as well in that space. And it is those people that ultimately determine what happens. It isn't the tools, it isn't the wall, it isn't the Mexican government, it's our own people. And they deserve our support. Texas has given that support. But what we know is that it hasn't worked. We've tried the theory for over a year, maybe a year and a half now, we're closing in on, not quite. And while there have been some marginal benefits, you've built some more wall, if you look at the numbers crossing into your state, invading your state, that has not changed. And so what is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Yes, this is the federal government's primary responsibility, but states on the border have the ability to defend themselves and to repel the invasion. Our experience, my time at the Department of Homeland Security, shows very clearly that if illegals believe they have a low probability of entering, many of them will not come. We saw, and I don't know how many of you saw this, Joe Biden's hand-picked current head of the Border Patrol, Rodney Scott's successor, after they pushed him out because he was too intent on doing his job right, and he did. Ortiz, under oath, oaths are a nice thing, said no consequences, no change in the flow. And the reason for the invasion is that this administration has made it clear there will be no consequences. That's their own head of the Border Patrol, politically picked head of the Border Patrol today. Joe Biden official under oath. But he told the truth. He told the truth. No consequences, no slowing the flow. And they have to be returned quickly. We know this can be done. And Texas can do it. Arizona can do it. New Mexico and California could do it, but I think we all know that as a political matter, that ain't happening. So there's three prongs to this at the state level. The governors of border states have to declare an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. They have to make their own finding that that's what's happening to my state. Now, legislators have to be supportive. Texas has already, your legislature has already demonstrated their willingness and ability to do this more than any other state. They've sent money, they've expanded authority, for instance, for the criminal trespass example. I would suggest that making sure that they can deputize, quickly and easily deputize out-of-state personnel into the governor's chain of command so that other states can contribute to the effort is something that all the border states should do to be prepared. That's something else legislators can do. And then you can bet there's going to be lawsuits, welcome to America, right? I used to joke at the Department of Homeland Security that my choice to wear a blue tie or a green tie at the beginning of the day would spawn the first lawsuit. So you're anti-green. This is litigious. Now, people are not used to this. If you go to the Center for Renewing America, we have a paper on this subject that I would urge you to read. It's only 8 to 10 pages long. It will not take you forever to read. It's pretty straightforward in that sense. But the case law may surprise you. So as I told you, the invasion definition hasn't been litigated before, and that's true. But the guarantee clause has been litigated before. In 1849, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that was a case nominally about the Republican form of government of one of the Northeast states. And in fact, there was some violence involved, so arguably you could say factually that it also involved insurrection against the state government. The other two elements that the federal government is obligated to protect states from. So it went up to the Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, this is a decision for the political branches. Lawyers would call that non-justiciable. The court acknowledged it did not have authority to decide the case. It said this is a decision dedicated to the legislative branch, and in 1795, in the Militia Act, they in turn assigned it to the president. Makes sense, right? Back then, Congress wasn't around much. If you have to make a quick militia decision, that's part of why you have an executive branch. The court ruling was that it wasn't their decision. I mentioned that Georgia used to be the southwest border. And this is where that comes back in. So, when Article 1 was ratified in 1789, and Georgia was the southwest border, if there was a question whether Georgia was being invaded, under what existed at the time, they could send a message to Washington describing the problem, asking for an answer and for help, and maybe an answer could come in 3 weeks if you kill some horses both ways. And troops could arrive in 2 months or so in meaningful numbers. That decision was the governor of Georgia's. That's why it wasn't a trip to Washington and a trip back. Okay, but today, a governor on the border can call the president in an instant. Troops can be on planes within hours, and that's all true. But that doesn't change who has legal authority. That's why that history is so important, right? Technology changes, and we have to apply constitutional protections to the new technology, like cell phones, for instance. But it's the same rules. The challenge is how to apply them, not who gets to decide. The proper ruling, if a state along the border uses this power and gets sued by the federal government, the proper ruling by the court, consistent with the only Supreme Court case anywhere close to this power, is that it is not the court's business. And even people who support this struggle, but it isn't defined, war isn't defined, blah. The reason the founders said, look, this is so obvious we don't even need to waste time on it, is because they expected us to be reasonable. We're not talking about rolling tanks to Mexico City. We're not talking about planes bombing bridges. We're talking about one of the most mild applications, or really availabilities, of force you could imagine under war powers. Let me give you an operational example. You're all familiar with Title 42, which is the public health order on the border. We just refer to it as Title 42 because that's the legal source of authority. Well, under Title 42, in March of 2020, CDC issued a border order that even today, as bad as it is today, this may surprise you, over half of all illegal border crossers are returned back into Mexico without ever being processed on an immigration basis under that public health order. Still over half. When I was the deputy secretary, we were over 90% returns in under 2 hours. and they never came into facilities, very rarely came into facilities. And that was intentional. That was very intentional. Operationally, a state exercising this power looks exactly like Title 42. It's just state officials instead of federal officials. So what I would do if I were involved in the operational management, and some of your sheriffs already have this material, I'd thumbprint each person, I'd take their picture, associate it with the biometrics, get as close as I could to age, etc., any alleged family connections. I'd drive them back to the border, give them a bag of food and water, say you walked here, walk back. Over the border. Now for y'all, that means a boat ride. So you're going to have to set up the Texas ferry service. And it also means, because the international boundary is in the middle of the Rio Grande, that you have to enter Mexico to deposit them in Mexico. That's a war power. That's a war power. Not a big deal. Listen to me say that. Maybe the president of Mexico might disagree. But then he can stop them from coming. Amen. So Title 42 is your model for operationally what this looks like. Is it exactly the same? No, it's not exactly the same. But I also want to point out, and you're going to see it ad nauseum up here shortly, this is not immigration law. Please get that through your head. This is not immigration law, any more than enforcing that public health order is immigration law. That's public health law. The fact that the Border Patrol is implementing public health law does not change the fact that it is public health law. In the same place and with the same people who enforce immigration law. It is a different source of authority. Different sources of legal authority can exist for the same situation in the same place at the same time. It isn't just one. There's really no limit. The source of this authority is the Constitution. It's not Title 8, which is immigration. It's not Title 42, public health. It is the Constitution itself. It's the reserved powers your state has under the Constitution. And as I noted, in your state constitution, Article 4, Section 7 of the Texas Constitution, makes the governor the commander-in-chief. That is common. It's the way most states operate. The governor is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard and authorities of your state. He can, as he has, activate guards units and for duty along the border. They can be combined with law enforcement. These are perfectly capable personnel to do the kind of job we're talking about. Local law enforcement can help in their area, but it will be important that all those actively engaged in this repelling of the invasion be within the governor's chain of command. It is important for those individuals' legal protection if and when the federal government were to try to sue them individually for civil rights violations. Not that they would ever do that. By the way, if you, especially for the law enforcement folks here, if you're interested in that subject, we have analyzed, I'm a lawyer, so I can get on both sides, right? So I get on the other side, I pretend I'm prosecuting it, and then I get on the defense side and I defend it. And that analysis is also written out at the Center for Renewing America website. It is a failed undertaking for the government. Doesn't mean they won't make the arrest, doesn't mean they won't try the prosecutions, but it fails on 3 different elements. So, but part of the reason for that is that it is in the governor's chain of command. That's a protection for those individuals. Deputization can be used for that I mentioned earlier. Of course, in doing this, a governor should explain the failure. I don't think anybody has to be convinced, and then make their justification statement, declare the invasion, and then point out, as should be obvious to all, that the Constitution trumps statutes. Now, Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, None of them by themselves have the resources to do this job completely. But you have undoubtedly noticed over the last year, year and a half, governors from around the country who have said, I'm willing to help. It's my Warren Zevon quote, send lawyers, guns, and money. I'd sing it for you, but then you'd all run screaming from the place. I can't sing. But it's true, and they have the authority to do that. If you have the ability within Texas law to deputize these folks from other states, then they can participate, and you can, on a multi-state basis, without a compact. Compacts require congressional approval. Not gonna happen. No compact. So you have to be able to handle it under your own state's law. That means you have to be able to deputize people who that state is willing to send into your chain of command. If you can do that, I imagine you can, it's a matter of how complicated it is, then you can expand available resources to perform this mission. And of course, states can just send you their money. I haven't seen anybody do that yet. Don't laugh. It's real. I think there are states that would do it. So what's going to happen if this really is tried? Whoop. So the president may try to federalize your Guard. Activate the Guard for federal service. It's a very low standard for the president to do this, but it is not no standard. And this is where your Attorney General comes in, and Ken Paxton doesn't seem to have any sort of a problem suing Joe Biden, so I don't think you'll have a problem there. So this could be a legal fight, but it would be initiated by Texas or the border state, Arizona being the other more likely one, as opposed to a fight over the invasion question. This is a fight over the authority to nationalize the Guard. And if you think about this, the legal fights that will roll here, it puts them in a very interesting position, the last bullet here. So the president has to roll in and argue, we're not being invaded. Oh, sure. Why don't we adjourn this court and take it up on an Eagle Pass? Or in the Rio Grande Valley. We'll just do outdoor court for a day. I've been in outdoor court in Virginia for citizenship ceremonies, interestingly enough, on July 4th in Williamsburg. It's a nice setting for doing it the right way, which we appreciate. Another way you could see federal pushback is they will try to trap us inside a case called Arizona versus the United States. Some of you may remember this. This is back in 2012, where Arizona was attempting to itself enforce immigration law, to assist forcibly the federal government, and the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the state couldn't do that, that the federal government had sole oversight of immigration law. I don't think that case was decided correctly. I think the current Supreme Court would decide it differently. Nonetheless, until they do, that is the law of the land. But remember, what aren't we talking about? Immigration law. But the president will come in and try to say, no, this is just immigration under, it's an excuse. They're just, and the media will play along with that. I know that will shock you. But this is constitutional self-help preserved by the states for their own authority. It's not statutory law. The Constitution, of course, trumps. And as I said, your Attorney General is going to end up tangling over this. And the best way for this to take place is, of course, with those two working in tandem. Not a surprise, making the case publicly, declaring the invasion by the governor, being prepared for the immediate litigation by the Attorney General, as well as follow-on litigation, challenging the federal government. Now, here's an interesting question for you all non-lawyers. To carry forward a case, if you want to sue, you have to be injured. Well, if Texas were to start defending its own border, how is the United States government injured? Government, not United States, the government, how are they injured? And I think they're going to have to say, well, it offends our sensibilities. Or more likely, this interferes with our ability to conduct foreign relations because they're messing around with Mexico. And they may survive on that basis, on the injury basis. However, that isn't going to make the case justiciable. The Supreme Court precedent, such as it is, will be hard to overcome. Did I mention this is not immigration law? That is very important. We don't talk about deporting people. And the other highlighted item on here, I mentioned we're not talking tanks and planes. The important element of war powers to utilize is the power over prisoners of war. You completely avoid all legal process in the immigration system. There's no habeas corpus related to war powers, a concern raised by an individual in the Attorney General's office. And you are bound by treaties. The only really meaningful treaty here is the Convention Against Torture, a finding by the governor that Mexico doesn't torture its citizens or people entering its territory, which is a very reasonable finding, satisfies the Convention Against Torture. And since the federal government is already returning people to Mexico, they couldn't do that if they believe the Mexican government wasn't abiding by the Convention Against Torture. So, but I do want you to realize you are still subject to other restrictions and restraints, one of them being our treaty obligations. And of course, I don't really expect Mexico to appreciate this so much, but the best thing they can do is defend their own southern border. They have proven they can do that when they choose to. And there will be some interaction between Texas and Mexico. And if it's Texas, as opposed to Arizona, where they have a land border, it's easy enough to put a person over a line. It's a little harder when you've got to cross the water logistically, and legally you've got to enter their country, because you're not going to dump them in the middle of the river. You're going to put them on land, and and that that can bring you in conflict with authorities on that side of the river, and that's a reality. And so while this is a low intensity, meaning you really just have to be able to protect your forces. I mean, the cartels are running this show, but every single person coming across is an invader. And if we just say it's the cartels, then there's no point to doing this. Because if you look at a caravan coming across, heck, if a professional's looking at it, you tell me who in there is from the cartel. You can't. A better way to think of it is they're the generals and everybody else are privates, if you want to put it in military terms. Privates don't start wars, they fight wars, right? Well, they're all invaders, even that little 2-year-old, and that's hard for people to accept. And while there may be different degrees of culpability, every single one of them decided to violate our laws and to invade our country. And this power would only be exercised between ports of entry. If they want to come in the right way, they can go to a port of entry. And no border state would mess with that. Really, be very difficult to do that. I'm not suggesting it. There are other things, of course, states can do, state legislatures can do. I just list a few here. I know Mark Morgan referenced the effort by the Heritage Foundation to collect these together. I want to say they've put together a list of 29 things. Texas has done some of them. but but there's plenty more that can be done. One that Texas has done here is the second bullet here. Very, very helpful to have that information available. I've highlighted the bottom bullet because it's a pet peeve of mine, and I would just ask each of you to keep this in mind, and when you speak about the immigration issue and the invasion of our country, keep in mind who's hurt first and worst. Our poor people. And I'm all for our poor people. The low end of the wage market is flooded by illegals. It depresses wages at the lowest end of the scale and deprives them of jobs. I want people, of all the problems, I want employers to have to pay more because our poor people are in demand. That's how they become not poor people. That's what we want. That's what we want for them. But we want to, and really what we want there is opportunity, right? That's not a handout. They do it themselves. And that's the right way to do it, morally and sustainably. We need to make the case that those of us who believe in protecting our border are also, as part of that, we are for protecting American poor people. And the numbers bear that out. The end of 2019, right before COVID, the economy was going gangbusters. But did you know we reached the lowest poverty rate in history, recorded history in America? 10.4%. Not just low unemployment, the lowest poverty rate. And that's because if you looked inside those numbers of performance there in 2019, percentage-wise, the poorest Americans did the best. And that wasn't tax cuts. I should say it wasn't just tax cuts. It wasn't just deregulation. It was also enforcing the laws as best we could with all the impairments we had in the immigration space to preserve the opportunity for those people to move up and have better lives. It's a big deal. So, pet peeve of mine, hopefully not too far of a distance. I'm only going to zero in on one of these. I mentioned the heritage list. I don't think this is on it. The bottom of this is what I want to zero in on. When I was Attorney General of Virginia, I had employers come into me and say, Ken, my competitors are hiring these people who are, I know they're not legal and I can't compete and I want you to do something about it. Well, I didn't have any tools as AG. If you were mandating E-Verify, I'd have a tool. But you could also set up liability, add to your unfair competition law the ability for a business owner to sue competitors for unfair competition by hiring illegals, give them liquidated damages, that this $10,000, so they don't have to prove damages, and pay their attorney's fees if they win. And let the people who know the industry the best police it. Texas Constitution. Closing in on 150 years since the 1875 Constitution. The Article 4, Section 7 I mentioned that makes the governor the commander-in-chief. There at the end you see what was deleted in 1999. It was deleted because it was deemed repetitive of repel invasions. All of that is included in repel invasions. I would treat what's coming over the border as a massive series of predatory bans. Not everybody's Pancho Villa. They don't have to be. But you heard lots of presentations today about the damage being done here in your state. I think it's pretty easy to determine they're predatory. That convention, they'd clear concern and interesting. You know, they were worried the federal government wasn't protecting their border. So we're not the first. We're not the first. And they were, at the time, petitioning the federal government for more help. They weren't getting more help. They wanted to make sure that their governor had the authority to respond to this. That's why the clear designation of commander-in-chief. They all accepted that the federal government had its war powers, but they also explicitly stated Texas's reservation of its own power to protect itself. And I underline this from that history because I think it's just so amazing how history keeps repeating itself. And they had the concerns then. They did something about it. And nobody complained. Nobody sued them. There was no ACLU. And back then, neither side of the aisle would suggest that a state didn't have the authority to protect itself. Federal government isn't protecting us from invasion. The border states, at least, have the power to declare themselves invaded and to take steps to protect themselves. I've told you operationally what this looks like. It looks like that Title 42 operation at the federal level, but executed by state authorities, state officials. I've also told you some of the ways the federal government will strike back at states that attempt to do this. But I believe it is coming. It is coming. Kerry Lake in Arizona has been running explicitly on this. We've had conversations with some of her folks and my federal experience. It isn't just the governor. If you have officials responsible for executing these sorts of orders, they have to be on board. Ask President Trump. I was talking to Brian Harrison, one of your newest reps here, who was in HHS while I was at DHS, and the internal resistance was extraordinary. Think of it in federal terms. It's one thing to have a Secretary of Homeland Security who supports an aggressive border policy, but HHS takes care of the children. So if they're not on board, they can block you up. If you don't have a Secretary of Defense who's completely on board, they will resist and stall resources you need. If you don't have a Secretary of State who is completely on board, they will throw roadblocks in the way on the diplomatic front. If you don't have a Secretary of the Treasury who is completely on board, they will throw the monetary blocks in the way. If you don't have an Attorney General who is on board, they'll give you one reason after another you can't do this. I've led large cadres of government lawyers twice in my career at the state and federal level. My quip for those lawyers is, good lawyers, good government lawyers, don't tell me no, they tell me how. And it's for me to decide if the price is too high. Lawyers advise, clients decide. And lawyers who don't do that don't stay working for me very long. So with that, I'm happy to take some of Kelly's written questions that flow through you all. Again, relatively short write-ups of this are available at the Center for Renewing America website. And I would also urge you to read Mark Brnovich's absolutely stupendous AG opinion from Arizona from earlier this year. It really is outstanding. And I don't say that because it has the same position. I'm telling you, it is a high-quality product. It is very good legal work. It is very well done. He did a great job. And like I said, you all are well positioned for this. You have some challenges, particularly the Rio Grande, but it's overdue in many respects. You have a race to win first, but I would sure like to see Texas leading the way again, because I can tell you, Arizona's gonna. So, it's going to be beneficial to America to put them on their heels, the federal government that is failing to do its job, and put them in the position of having to argue we're not being invaded, while one or two states actually solve the problem. And let's talk about solve. That means a significantly lower number of people come over your border between the ports of entry. That's the measure of success. They don't come in the first place. Will some of them come into the United States? Yes, they'll go to California and they'll go to New Mexico. The cartels will change the routes, but it's still going to make it harder for them. And that will reduce the overall numbers for everybody else as well. All right, Kelly, what do you got for me?
Okay. What is your response to those who claim invoking Article 1 will result in a bloodbath and a full-scale war?
Well, given that it looks pretty much exactly like Title 42 enforcement, we've had 2.5 years of Title 42 enforcement where that hasn't happened. So one thing to remember is it's natural for us to look at the border from the north. It's a funny thing to say, but put yourself in Mexico City and look at it from the south. The officials you see from the Mexican government along the border are really a show. They do not control northern Mexico. So, and this goes in, by the way, to the question of who might qualify as an invader. We invaded Afghanistan because the government of Afghanistan didn't control Afghanistan. You remember that? I remember that. Well, the government of Mexico does not, and perhaps never has in its history, controlled all of Mexico. And so, looking back to them complaining about this in 1875, similar problem. Pancho Villa, they had a dispute over who was the government, and different factions controlled different parts of Mexico. We're not dealing with a country like our own. Mexico is very proud. They have plenty to be proud of, but they do not control their own country, particularly our border. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And we do have to be prepared for escalation by cartels. We have to be using intel. This isn't just a law enforcement undertaking. There are going to be protective elements where we're going to want to look into Mexico to see what's happening there to protect our people. That's one thing that your governor has strenuously emphasized every step of the way, and I respect it. It's easy to say, go stand in harm's way. It's an easy thing to throw around. Some of you have done that. It's a much harder thing to be responsible for it. And that does come with that invasion declaration. It takes on an awful lot of responsibility because it is possible. We're dealing with the most evil, vicious people in the Western Hemisphere. That's who we're contending with. That's who's running this. Remember, everyone who comes over is an invader. But different people are different levels of guilty. Hitler was more guilty than the SS, was more guilty than the Wehrmacht. They were all wrong. Just different degrees of wrong. Different degrees of wrong. And that's true in any situation where evil is happening. There are different degrees of responsibility. We have to be ready for it. We can't assume it won't happen. But thus far, it has not in the analogous situation that has been implemented for 2.5 years now.
I don't know if you really want this one, but this one is a good one. Is organ harvesting part of the human trafficking that is occurring?
My understanding is that it is. There obviously, it's hard to get data on any of these things. There's no reliable source for data, but it has been encountered, which tells me yes, it is. And one of the things the cartels are doing, and I'm sure you've heard it today, by directing the flows, they occupy our border security, border patrol. And they run their high value operations elsewhere with full vision of where our personnel are. Full vision of where they are. They have a very extensive intel network. And the more you're going to do, and we're talking about doing more here, being more aggressive, the more intel you need. So it'll be necessary for the state to have oversight, overwatch, of those areas where the kinds of victims you're describing, Kelly, are probably coming through. What Mark Morgan, I'm guessing, probably talked about gotaways to some degree. Those are the folks you really worry about, are the ones we don't see. And for their sake, too, there is a humanitarian element to this. And these are human beings. These are people. They have human dignity like everybody else. Just, when you arrest someone in Austin for committing a crime, they're still a human being. They may have committed a crime. They're still a human being. And we want them treated that way by others, and we treat them that way ourselves. There's a lot of sympathy to be had here. Doesn't change what we're dealing with, but it does point up the incredible level of evil that we're contending with.
And then also, there's so many that are coming in, not all of them. They're used to this. They're used to that level of evil. It's part of their everyday. And they're moving into our neighborhood. Okay, so do you know what the present state of our border wall is? And if
Stagnant.
and if any is being built, and do we know about any contracts out there?
I don't know about any contracts. There's piles of steel across the border. It is ironic to see even this administration finally kind of give way and fill some gaps because it solves problems even for them. And but all the meaningful wall building right now is going on by Texas and Arizona. Yep. Yeah, yeah. So it could hold the wall. Yeah. Yeah. And for those who didn't know, prior to his extensive law enforcement and management career, Mark Morgan was, true fact, a construction engineer. So, um, no, I tell people before I went to the dark side, I was an engineer. So it's one more thing we have in common. So, all right, Kelly.
Okay, and I may read this wrong because when I hear it, when looking at it, it doesn't make sense to me right away. But can an Article 5 Convention of States help to prevent future issues at our border if we can add term limits to the Constitution?
Hell yes. I mean, if the way Washington operates is part of the problem. That's the point of term limits, right?
Okay.
Is to change how Washington operates. It's not a guarantee, but I think if the founders could come back and do it over again, and I think a lot about this, and I read a lot about this, I think the one thing they would do different is term limits. And if they could do two things, it'd be a balanced budget requirement.
This one's good. Tell us how to access the Arizona AG document you mentioned.
Well, the way I do it is I Google it. Now, Google is a verb. For the record, I use DuckDuckGo. So I don't want them getting any of my stuff. So they've already got my Gmail. So it's not a case. It's a legal opinion. State attorneys general can be asked for legal opinions on the law. And Representative Jake Hoffman in Arizona made such a request to the attorney general toward the end of last year, and the Attorney General answered it, as I said, the end of January, beginning of February. I'm not sure how they structure them. You can go to the Arizona Attorney General's website. In Virginia, for obvious reasons I know best, we list them by month. I'm not sure if they do it that way, but if you search on Article 4, Section 4, among his opinions, it should come up. It shouldn't be hard to find. So it also got a lot of news, so you'll probably catch it through an article and then a link from an article over to the opinion. It's a very good opinion.
Okay, this president has done more to endanger our lives on the border as president and when he was also vice president than anyone in history. He, of course, we all know, needs to be punished. What are we looking at for treason?
Well, you know, I'll switch it to impeachment, and I laugh about that because what if you pull it off? Dog that caught the car there, and then we end up with a committed left-wing Stalinist who doesn't have dementia, and I'd rather have the one with dementia. I think that Mayorkas is actually very exposed to impeachment. He's lied to Congress under oath on multiple occasions. I mean, the evidence is there if Congress chose to go forward with it. Of course, you're not going to get 2/3 of the Senate, so is it worth it? I mean, it's why we focus so much on elections. We've got to take the House, we've got to take the Senate, but with people who will then make use of that leadership position. The Republicans have failed to do that in the past. Here's Ken's prediction. You're going to hear, oh, our margins are just too close. Interpretation, it's too close to fight. It's always after the next election, right? And what we've seen, and President Trump proved this, is that even that kind of lily-livered mentality can be made to do constructive things with the right president. But, you know, the legislature over the years has given up its role and authority, and they need to reclaim it. And this used to be an area of bipartisan agreement. Much like, by the way, election integrity used to be an area of relatively general agreement. It was all a debate about mechanics and amounts. And it has become a partisan divide, unfortunately, which doesn't help move the ball forward. But it does make it all the more important for states to step up and do what they can, because they can prove that the left's arguments are wrong by action. By action. Actions speak louder than words. We all know that. Drive the numbers actually down on your border by actually defending the border, and it will be an awfully hard argument for the other side to make to say that it doesn't work when it's working. This is, I use the election example again. We all remember the Georgia explosion over their election reforms, which were fairly modest. But it was Jim Crow 2.0, we were told, by none less than the president himself and the, unfortunately for her, current candidate for governor in Georgia. And you know it's bad when, which is a category of mine, you know it's bad when even the Washington Post calls you a pants on fire liar. And that's what happened. Fast forward to this May, and all of the alleged voter suppression and, oh, they're so evil, this terrible stuff, blah, blah, blah. Highest turnout by minorities and everybody else they've ever had. George Washington was once asked, do you think God is on our side during the Revolutionary War? And his answer is supposed to have been, it is not. That he be on our side, but that we be on his. Truth is a powerful, powerful ally, but it has to be revealed. It has to be revealed. And that's an opportunity here for border states using their own authority. It's a real opportunity. It's terrible that America goes through these cycles where we give these just nut job left-wingers the wheel periodically, and then much of America goes, oh yeah, that's why we don't give these people the wheel. And yet, it's too late for years. And our side never undoes the damage. You remember all the gnashing of teeth and so forth over Obamacare? I mean, heck, we're in Texas. Ted Cruz led that fight to actually get rid of Obamacare. Who fought him harder than anybody else? Republicans. John McCain never fought a Democrat so hard as he fought conservative Republicans. And the list goes on that. So it isn't enough to have majorities. They've got to be with people who are willing to put it on the line. I will say this, I'll use a counterexample. When Nancy Pelosi passed Obamacare, she knew she was giving up the speakership, and she did it anyway. There aren't many things that I would say she's done right, although follow through with the Taiwan trip would be one recently. I'll give her credit. But wouldn't you love to see that kind of leadership on our side? Yep. Yeah. All right, Kelly. You've got the clock, so I'll go. I can keep doing this all day.
Well, I had a couple of them I took out because they addressed the AG and Governor Abbott. So I will not address those. This one says, do you agree? Will we not have to take out cartels like we did ISIS in Iraq? I know that one's a little deep and it's...
Yeah, I get it. So let me step back from the border. I mentioned the lack of control of Mexico of their own country. It should be a strategic goal of the United States to assist Mexico in getting control of its own country. We don't want their country. Heck, I'd give them certain parts of our country, but a little west of here. But it is in our interest that they have sovereignty and control over every inch of Mexican territory. The lack of focus and effort on that goal is a bipartisan failure. And we don't fix it if we don't acknowledge it. It's a bipartisan failure. And so there's a lot of tools we should be bringing to bear to make that a reality. And I mean, the suffering down there from those cartels it's unbelievable. And it isn't just left-right bias. The chronicling, which is one of the things journalists are supposed to do, of the horrors is so bad that they can't publish it or they're unwilling to. And I understand because I've seen it. Mark's seen it. Rodney's seen it. We've all seen this stuff. We've seen what they do. They use terrorist tactics. to run organized crime organizations and to exercise governance over their parts of Mexico. It's a very complicated situation.
I think that was our last one.
All right. Well, that's ending on a happy note, huh? Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're going to call it a day. I would like some feedback from you on some of this. Most of you emailed me somehow a registration, one way or the other. So I would like to hear what you have to say. We, in my mind, this was the last time we were going to do this, but we've had some suggestions for some other things, and I will look into those. But I would like to hear what you have to say. So I want to thank you for coming. I know a lot of you traveled a long way. Please be safe going home. Thank you.